Somewhere in a cave in what is now Israel, roughly 100,000 years ago, a group of early humans buried one of their own. Not just placed the body in the ground, buried it deliberately with red ochre pigment, with a deer antler placed in the hands, with the body arranged in a specific position facing a specific direction. Grief, it turns out, is older than writing, older than farming, older than most things we consider civilization. And what ancient humans actually did with that grief is far stranger than simply crying it out. Think about grief for a second, the way you understand it today. Maybe you picture stages. Maybe you picture time healing things. Maybe you picture something private, something you process quietly, mostly alone. Now erase all of that, because for the overwhelming majority of human history, grief wasn't private at all. It was one of the most public, physical, and structured experiences a person could go through. And understanding how ancient humans handled it reveals something uncomfortable about how modern life handles it worse. Archaeologist Paul Pettit, who has spent decades studying Paleolithic burial practices, has documented that intentional burial of the dead stretches back at least 100,000 years, likely further. What's striking isn't just that ancient humans buried their dead, it's how much effort went into it. Bodies were positioned carefully, sometimes in a fetal curl, as if returning to the position of birth. Grave goods were included, tools, ornaments, and in some sites, food, suggesting a belief that death wasn't a full ending, but a transition requiring preparation. This wasn't casual disposal, this was ritual, and ritual takes time, cooperation, and shared belief among an entire group. Here's what that tells you immediately. Grief in early human societies was never meant to be handled by one person alone. It was distributed physically across an entire community through labor. Digging a grave, gathering ochre, carving grave goods, arranging the body. These are not solitary tasks. They require multiple people working together for hours, sometimes days. Compare that to how grief typically works now. Someone dies. There's a short window of intense social support, a funeral, some casseroles, some phone calls, and then, often within a week or two, the world moves on and expects the grieving person to move on with it, largely alone, largely internally, largely in silence. This is where the work of psychologist George Bonanno becomes essential. Bonanno, who has spent much of his career studying resilience and bereavement, found something that challenges a lot of popular assumptions about grief. His research shows that grief doesn't reliably follow the neat, universal stages many people assume exist. Instead, Bonanno's studies found that most people are far more psychologically resilient than expected, and that grief tends to resolve more smoothly when it includes ongoing social connection, ritual, and shared meaning-making, rather than isolated internal processing. In other words, the ancient approach, physical, communal, structured around shared labor and ritual, aligns far more closely with what modern research says actually helps people grieve well. The modern approach, brief public support followed by prolonged private processing, is closer to the opposite of what the evidence suggests works. So, why did we drift so far from what seems to have worked for most of human history? Part of the answer lies in how grief rituals functioned beyond just emotional support. Anthropological records across many small-scale societies, from indigenous groups in the Americas to hunter-gatherer communities studied throughout the 20th century, show mourning periods that often lasted weeks or months, involving specific behaviors, wearing particular clothing or markings, temporary changes in diet, restrictions on certain activities, and communal storytelling about the deceased. These weren't arbitrary customs. They served as visible signals to the rest of the group. This person is grieving. Adjust your expectations of them. Support them accordingly. Modern life removed almost all of these visible signals. There's no ochre marking, no distinctive mourning clothing in most contexts, no ritualized behavior that announces to strangers, coworkers, or even casual acquaintances that a person is inside an active grieving process. Grief became invisible, which meant the social permission to behave differently, to need more support, to move slower, largely disappeared along with the visible markers.
There's a third layer here, tied to something psychiatrist Elizabeth Kübler-Ross became known for, though often misunderstood. Kübler-Ross's original research, focused on terminally ill patients rather than grieving survivors, proposed that people move through emotional stages when confronting death and loss. While later research, including Bonanos, found these stages aren't universal or linear the way pop psychology often presents them, Kübler-Ross's deeper insight often gets lost. She argued strongly that grief needed witnessing, that people needed somewhere to express difficult emotions without being rushed, judged, or corrected. Ancient grief rituals, structured around community and shared labor, provided exactly that kind of sustained witnessing by default. You didn't need to ask for space to grieve. The entire community's behavior around you created it automatically.
This is the piece modern grief is missing most. Not a checklist of stages to move through correctly, but a structure of ongoing, visible, communal witnessing that doesn't require the grieving person to explain or justify their pain to anyone. Think about how strange this makes modern bereavement leave. Most workplaces offer 3 to 5 days off. Ancient humans, working with far fewer resources and far harder daily survival demands, still carved out weeks of communal, structural adjustment around a single death. Somehow, a society with immeasurably more free time, more resources, and more capacity to accommodate grief chose to compress it into less time than societies with almost nothing.
This isn't a case for returning to ochre burial rituals specifically.
It's a case for recognizing what those rituals were actually doing functionally, making grief visible, making it shared, and stretching support across weeks instead of days. Modern humans still grieve exactly the way ancient humans did, physiologically and emotionally. What changed isn't the grief itself. What changed is the container built around it, shrinking from an entire community's shared labor into a single, overwhelmed individual's private, mostly invisible experience.
So, the next time someone you know loses someone, consider what a 100,000-year-old grave in a cave in Israel can teach you that a sympathy card cannot. Grief was never meant to be carried quietly, alone, on a tight schedule. It was meant to be dug into the earth by many hands, marked visibly for weeks, and witnessed by an entire community until the person carrying it was ready to stand again. Somewhere in a cave in what is now Israel, roughly 100,000 years ago, a group of early humans buried one of their own. And in doing so, they understood something about grief that much of the modern world has quietly, accidentally forgotten.